Welcome to Real Scoop Live, a show for pool chemistry enthusiasts where we talk about all the coolest chemistry stuff you never knew you wanted to know. Any chemical advice or suggestions are opinion and utilized at the discretion of each individual pool operator. With that out of the way, let's start the show.
You walk along that street, talking nervously. Closer won't be long now. You made me write this song.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Real Scoop Live. It's season 3, episode 4, CYA. And I don't know about you, but for me, CYA means cover your assets. And that is not what we are talking about today on the Real Scoop Live. So I am going to pass it over to Matt and Brett so they
It kind of is.
Chemical knowledge.
Thank you, Stacy. So, cover your assets. It's not necessarily, and we know that the last word of that probably isn't exactly what you meant, because everyone knows what CIA stands for in most of their lives. But when you say cover your assets, it can and can't mean that, because we are talking about the amount of money that people put into pools, not only the chemistry of pools, but maintaining the pools, how everything keeps the pools running longer and lasting longer and all that stuff. And so in a sense, it is really covering your assets, but CYA in pool nomenclature actually is the abbreviation that most people talk about, cyanuric acid. And so cyanuric acid actually is one of the things in the pool industry that actually goes by a whole bunch of names. You can consider it, some people or some national chemical brands call it stabilizer, and some call it conditioner, and some even have liquid versions, and there's granular versions, and it's all kind of, it all is the same exact thing. It's just that it's different terms for it. So it's kind of like some chemical companies will have stuff called alkalinity increaser or alkalinity plus or alkalinity addition and so it's all the same stuff. It's all just alkalinity increaser. But with this, the stabilizer. So cyanuric acid is the main term for it, or like the technical term for it. But you can find it as stabilizer conditioner, especially in big box stores or national chains. And the problem is sometimes, especially when you have people that don't understand that they are the same things, they will associate names like stabilizer and conditioner with products other than cyanuric acid. So they'll think of
completely unrelated.
Completely unrelated, just like conditioner for your hair. They may think, oh, well, this is actually going to condition the water, make it feel nicer. Or stabilizers are going to stabilize pH as opposed to stabilizing chlorine, which is what cyanuric acid does. So sometimes homeowners will buy stabilizer at one place and conditioner at another place, or maybe liquid stabilizer at a third place, and not know that it's all the same thing.
UV protector at a fourth place.
Yeah, because it's all the same thing. So when in doubt, look at the little line at the very bottom that says cyanuric acid. And that way you know that you're not buying the same thing. Because here's the problem with cyanuric acid is that once you get it in there, it doesn't go away, right? So, and it really only goes up. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the primary function, because there is a good function for cyanuric acid as long as you have the proper amount. And that is that cyanuric acid actually acts like sunscreen for chlorine. And so if you have an outdoor pool, especially in areas where you have a ton of sun and a ton of UV rays that come into the pool, you need some cyanuric acid in there in order to prolong the life of your chlorine. And that's why it's important for a lot of people, for the bulk of pools that are out there.
In direct sunlight in a pool that has no cyanuric acid in it, you can lose half of your chlorine in just a couple hours. It happens super fast. So if you're talking about how to be economical, running a pool without cyanuric acid has some advantages, but they're greatly overrun by the detriment of losing your chlorine that fast, because you're pumping gallons in per day versus maybe a quart. I'm just throwing out a random example here, but if you're burning off half your chlorine in a couple hours, you have to replace that to make sure that you actually are maintaining enough to keep the pool safe to swim in.
That's right.
So the only purpose of cyanuric acid, the only reason we actually want it, is a single solitary purpose, and it's to protect your chlorine and keep it lasting longer in your water. So the question of man logic comes up, and I'm stealing that term from a different subject that we've talked about, because if a little bit's good, a lot's got to be better, right? Not necessarily. So when we think about that, we've got a narrow range of where we actually want to keep the cyanuric acid. We'll actually cover that one in the next slide. But we wanted to illustrate on this slide the different ways you can get it into your pool. So you add it, regardless of whether you realize it or not. You're the one that's putting it into your pool. So Matt, let's talk. Why don't you talk about granular and liquid, and I'll talk about trichlor and dichlor.
Okay. So I just wanted to point out that on the previous screen that was a little nod to all of our ASU fans out there with the little sun devil on there. But as to what my assignment is now, especially with this slide, we're talking about the different types of cyanuric acid that you can put in. Now, these are types that you would buy at a store or that you would buy online, wherever you would buy it. One is granular and one is liquid. Now, for the first, for 60, 70 years, the only way to get cyanuric acid into the water as an actual product was a granular version. And the thing about that is that stuff was very hard to dissolve. And so typically it would take 2 or 3 days to dissolve. And so even though the instructions on the back of the bucket or the back of the bottle would say, pour this slowly down your skimmer and then don't backwash your pool for 3 days, a lot of people would put them into like footies or pump basket socks, skimmer socks, that kind of thing, and then hang it off of the ladder and all that kind of stuff. But the thing about the granular cyanuric acid is that it will erode far faster than it will dissolve. And so that's why most of the buckets would say to put it down the skimmer, because that way it will go into your filter, and then that way the water would go through your filter and actually help to erode that faster. But even though you would say that, and you'd have the instructions on the back of the bottle, in my time as in retail and also as being a chemical specialist, you would come across a lot of people that would literally put that stuff in through the skimmer. The filter pressure would go up, and then they would clean the filter, and then they'd come back and say, "Why do I have no cyanuric acid? I just bought this." And it was because, well, the pressure is going to go up a little bit because you're literally adding stuff to the filter. But you have to remember not to backwash it or not to clean your element for 3 days. And so
at least 3 days. It could be more than that.
At least 3 days, yeah. The minimum was 72 hours. So I say 3 days just because 72 hours sticks in my head.
And Matt, one thing,
I'm getting old.
I don't want to cut you off on this, but granular cyanuric acid, if you add it too fast, it can combine with each other and turn into rocks. So there have been instances where people dumped way too much in the skimmer and essentially created rocks of cyanuric acid in the suction line between the skimmer and the pump. And it blocked the flow so much that the rocks just were there. So
that's right.
Be careful when you're adding it. Go a lot slower than you think you need to, or you can do the pantyhose trick like Matt was talking about. Just put it in there and hang it over the side.
So about 8 to 10 years ago, there was a new style of cyanuric acid that came out. I think it was about that long ago. That was the liquid cyanuric acid version. So instead of straight up cyanuric acid granules, is actually sodium cyanurate, which is in a liquid form, which you can pour into the pool, and you still get a little bit of residue, but it doesn't last as long. So that iteration is a little bit more expensive, a little less readily available, but it is out there. So if you need to add some, and you want convenience, you want to go with the liquid stuff. And if you want to save some money and you know that you won't be cleaning your filter pretty soon or very soon, then going with the granular. But either way, it's going to get the job done. And that's the whole thing about it, right?
Yep.
So, but that's not the only way that you're going to get cyanuric acid in your water, because there's a lot of products that are also out there that are putting cyanuric acid in your water without you even knowing it. And that's what Brett's going to talk about.
So most times when people are introducing cyanuric acid to their water, they're doing it inadvertently. So they're adding it along with the chlorine that they use. So if you look up here, we've got trichlor, which is your typical 3-inch chlorine tab that most people use. That they either feed through a feeder at the pump pad, or some people put them in the floaties. If you look at the actual chemical name, trichlor what's that? Cyanuric acid. It's in the tablet. Same thing with dichlor. Dichlor is a granular chlorine. Dichlor, cyanuric acid. It's in that one too. So if you're constantly treating your pool with these types of chlorine to keep your chlorine level at an appropriate level, you're not just adding chlorine, you're adding chlorine and you're adding cyanuric acid constantly. So Matt, percentage wise, trichlor tab, about a third of it, or up to about 40% of the tab is actually cyanuric acid.
I think nowadays, with the way that the tabs are made and supplied from around the world, that kind of fluctuates depending on the brand. But you can pretty much guess anywhere between a third, 30 and 40%, most likely cyanuric acid. And just a little part about this is that if you're looking at dichlor, because dichlor, especially if you buy stuff at a big box store, or sometimes it's called a shock when really it's a boost, it will say right on there that it's dichlortriazentrione, but that is the base component. So the mix together is the dichlorocyanuric acid, because the thing about dichlor is that it's a granular version of the chlorine. And it goes into solution right away, but it needs more cyanuric acid. Because it goes into solution, it needs more cyanuric acid to stay in the pool. So where trichlor actually dissolves or erodes, it puts that cyanuric acid in over a period of time, where dichlor goes into solution right away. So it needs the cyanuric acid extra amount in there to actually make it last long enough to create a 2 to 3 part per million in about 6,000 to 8,000 gallons per pound.
And that's just how it is. It's in those products. So one thing we say in a lot of the different trainings we do, if you're ever actively shocking your pool using chlorine, you probably shouldn't use dichlor as your shock, because not only if you're shocking with chlorine, typically you're trying to bring the chlorine level, the free chlorine level, up quite a bit. You would be adding so much extra cyanuric acid all in one go. It could essentially ruin the rest of your season if you bring it up that high, because you're adding quite a bit more than you think you are, and it builds faster and you never get rid of it. So
let's do a callback, Brett. I'm sorry for interrupting you. I bet you know how we both love to talk about all this stuff. Mm-hmm. But RSL has an episode called "Chlorine is a Verb."
Shock is
right?
a verb.
I'm sorry, shock is a verb. Sorry, shock is a verb. Okay, and so if you think back, or if you've watched that, that's one thing. But if you haven't watched it, we would suggest that you do. But the thing about it is that most of the time people shock a pool because they're trying to get rid of their combined chlorine or their used chlorine. And so in order to do that, you need to reach breakpoint chlorination, which we go through all, if you're a chemical geek, go ahead and watch that episode and, put some comments in there, because we see the comments and everything. But the thing is, though, is that when you use liquid chlorine, or if you use cal-hypo-based chlorine, the amount of chlorine that you need in order to get that combined chlorine to turn to gas or to get out of the water is so high that it's much easier to do it with those products than it is with dichlor. And that's what we're talking about, is that even though you might look at a product that says 99% dichlor, you need to look at what the available chlorine is. And a lot of times it's either 40%, 45%, 50%, something around in there. And that's not nearly enough. And so all of you out there, especially the guys that are in the industry that are big dichlor fans, that's totally fine if that's what you want to do. We're not going to tell you not to do what's been working for you. But if you're trying to affect a change and the oxidization of the chloramines, the best way to do that is to reach breakpoint chlorination. That's much easier with liquid chlorine and cal-hypo without adding a product that increases cyanuric acid, which then decreases the effectiveness of the chlorine. All right, so I'll shut up. Get off my soapbox.
You're good. So how much do you need? Really not a whole lot, 30 to 50 parts per million. And I wish I would have found the slide from the training that Matt gives where it actually puts into perspective how many pennies in $1 million. It illustrates parts per million, which it's infinitesimal. It's tiny. It's a very, very small amount. So 30 to 50 parts per million. And like we said, it never goes away. So once you get it in the water, should be good, right?
Should be.
Matt, I'm asking.
Well, we have all these nonverbal cues, right? So you're talking about something, and I'm thinking, let me talk about this, and then we go on to something else. But if I remember one of them about the part per million thing, it's if you stack dimes, 1 part per million in a million dimes is actually 2 miles. So if you look at that and you say, okay, 1 part per million is 1 dime and 2 miles of dimes, it's like, well, okay,
there you go.
That's not much. All right. So the thing about this is 30 to 50 is pretty much the sweet spot. And when you get the cyanuric acid there, that's awesome. But if you're not swimming a lot, if you're not backwashing a lot, if you're not splashing out a lot, but you're using trichlor or dichlor, then essentially what happens is every time you use those products, it's adding cyanuric acid, and there's no way for that to get out of there unless you are actively draining some water, splashing out some water, backwashing your filter, which doesn't happen with cartridge filters, but it does happen with DE and sand filters, because cyanuric acid doesn't evaporate either. So all of you out in the Southwest, they're having, feet of evaporation over the course of a couple weeks. None of this stuff is evaporating with it. Only the water evaporates. So you have all this compounding of the problem with cyanuric acid, especially when you're using products that have a bunch of cyanuric acid in them. Now, one or two other things. This 30 to 50 parts per million is kind of like the industry standard, and it really is kind of waffling back and forth. And so all of you that are in the industry, you've probably read some articles recently, especially from governmental agencies that recommend it really in the 15 to 30 mark.
It's trending much lower.
It's trending much lower, where if you have a saltwater pool, then it tends to be a little bit higher. So it can really be anywhere between 15 and 70, or maybe 15 and 75. But what happens essentially is that anything past 55 actually becomes detrimental. So that the further past 55, the less effective the chlorine is. Now with salt pools, because you're generating non-stabilized chlorine, typically the salt pool manufacturers or the cell manufacturers will tell you that they want it a little bit higher because you're not adding cyanuric acid products, which is fine. But if you look at running a commercial pool, if you have a defecation issue, the EPA will tell, or the CDC will tell you anything above 15, and they really recommend draining the pool. So that's where you get the 15 on the one side and the 70 to 75 on the other. So hopefully you don't have a defecation issue in your residential pool, but shit happens.
That makes a fool of us all.
You better bleep that, Stacy. All right. Anyway, sorry.
Where's the dump button?
Oh no.
Nice.
Okay, so we said it was only used to protect from sunlight, right? Indoor pools, generally not a whole lot of sunlight. So you don't need cyanuric acid at all at an indoor pool. Some different municipalities actually regulate it and say you can't have cyanuric acid at your indoor pool. So just different things to be aware of.
There's actually some municipalities that don't even want cyanuric acid in your pools at all. Yeah. And that's why and that's why in the last 8 or 10 years, the CalHypo style tablets have taken off, because those are actual tablets that are longer lasting, but they don't have any cyanuric acid in them. So if you're in an area where you can't have cyanuric acid, those are the ones to use.
But they're not interchangeable. Careful. Yeah, they're not interchangeable with trichlor tabs.
But CalHypo also leaves a calcium residue. So then instead of dealing with ineffective sanitizer or oxidizer, you're dealing with high amounts of calcium. So
we've talked about some of these things already, but what happens if your cyanuric acid is too high? A whole boatload of stuff. So Matt had mentioned your chlorine efficiency drops. So there's a point of diminishing returns. Once you get enough cyanuric acid in there, that's awesome. You get higher than that, your efficiency of your chlorine, it's essentially putting an anchor on it, so it can't make forward progress. It's pulling it back because it's not able to do what it needs to do to keep the water sanitary. So you could have a good solid 3 parts per million of chlorine in the water, but it could be only doing the work of 0.5 parts per million of chlorine. So essentially it greatly reduces what the chlorine that you're adding is doing. So if the bean counter in your head is going off, hang on, I'm having to add more chlorine to keep my pool sanitary, isn't that going to cost me longer? Yeah, it's going to cost you a lot more in the long run. So maintaining it at the right level is really important. This goes back to every single episode. I think we've talked about proactive, staying ahead of things. Don't let problems develop. This is a big one, because if you're monitoring what's going on in your water, you should never be the person who's surprised when you go to a pool store, they test the water, Well, you've got 300 parts per million of cyanuric acid, and we've seen it. It happens in pools that have been open for a long time, and they don't ever drain or refill or anything.
And what some of the stores might not be telling you is that they caused it, or at least they helped to cause
indirectly.
it, right? Indirectly, because a lot of people, a lot of personnel at the stores don't ask you what you're buying when you come in and buy your own thing, right? They just sell it to you because that's the way to do it. You probably know what you're talking about, and maybe you don't. So the proactive pool stores out there would say, hey, what are you doing? What are you buying that product for? I mean, what is it in your pool that's going on that you're using this product or that product for? And sometimes they're super busy, and we understand. But the thing is, though, is that a lot of people, especially DIYers that buy DIYers that buy it at big box stores, don't really know what they're buying, because there are a lot of chemical companies that will talk about dichlor being a shock. And so people buy extra bags of that, and when they have a problem, they put it in a whole bunch of bags. Next thing you know, they just compounded the problem because now the cyanuric acid is so high. And essentially, what we're talking about, if you boil it down, is that the higher the cyanuric acid is, the slower the kill rate of the chlorine is. So the chlorine can actually get so slow that it's not able to properly sanitize or oxidize the water. And so that's where we have the problem. And I was laughing earlier because Code Brown at the bottom.
Oh yeah.
We've mentioned a few times about pool pudding,
Yep.
right? Pool pudding is something that if you think about it, it would probably keep you out of public pools. But Code Brown is a nicer way to maybe put it. I don't know. It's just not as fun when we're talking about stuff, because pool pudding's much more funny. But anyway, the other part of it too is, and we just talked about interferences on a recent RSL, testing interferences on a recent RSL episode. The thing about this is that when you test total alkalinity, that you get a false reading with when you have a high stabilizer. So, without rehashing that whole thing, it's a third higher than what it should be. So the cyanuric acid, if it's at 100, that means it's taking a third of that, which is 33, and adding that onto your alkalinity. So it makes your alkalinity seem higher than it actually is. So that can definitely be an issue if you have high cyanuric acid, because we get tons and tons of calls about people saying, well, I think the cyanuric acid is 100. And then they do the high cyanuric acid test. Next thing you know, it's at 200 or 250 or 300. And believe it or not, for all you guys that know what we're talking about, it does get that high. And it's even higher in some cases. So if the kill rate of the chlorine slows, that means that the problems with unsanitary water, with algae outbreaks, and everything else that goes along with having low chlorine happens. And even though you're putting in a ton of chlorine, you're not getting the reaction that you think you should. A lot of times it's because the cyanuric acid is really high.
So the one down here where we talked about Code Brown or brown cloud, Cryptosporidium is a parasite that actually lives in human dukes. And it more readily enters the water when you do a brown cloud versus a formed poop.
Caddyshack.
Yeah.
A formed caddyshack.
So crypto can live in a regular chlorinated pool, 1 to 3 parts per million, for days. So the only way to get rid of it is to really ratchet up the free chlorine in there to actually break the protective shell, so you can actually get to the inside and kill the critter.
It's 50 parts per million for 3 days. So
50. It's a lot.
All of you that are in the industry, you know how hard it is to get chlorine up to 50. Now just imagine that you have to have it 50 for 72 hours.
So right? 50, that would be if the pool didn't have cyanuric acid. But you put a whole boatload of cyanuric acid in there, you've slowed down the effectiveness of your chlorine, so it's not working as fast for you. 50 is not enough to kill crypto. And it gets almost physically impossible to keep as much free chlorine pumping into that pool as you need to actually neutralize that parasite. That's why it becomes a big deal when you're thinking about that, because it can be super expensive to try and.
I'm resisting the euphemism that they say about me, is that don't pull Matt's string, because next thing you know is going to talk about for 30 minutes. There is a huge rabbit hole that we could go down here right now when it comes to not only the kill rate of chlorine, but what happens with cyanuric acid and alkalinity, and with reaching breakpoint chlorination. Because there's all kinds of things that cyanuric acid, especially really high cyanuric acid, touches that makes everything much harder or much more difficult. That if you're interested in something like that and you want to have a chat, feel free to call us on the 877 number, because there's a lot of stuff that it actually touches that can make life really miserable for the service tech. So how do I get my cyanuric acid level down? Well, there are some new products that are out there that have been around for a couple years, and I think a lot of people that are watching this have probably used some of them, and some work and some don't. And really,
they work for you. Awesome.
If it did, it did. There are a lot of hoops you have to jump through correctly, and if you miss one of them, then odds are it probably didn't work as effective as you hoped. But what we do know is that draining water out is very effective. So if you have a high cyanuric acid and you want to get rid of it fast and you're not in a drought, which I have a very recent tale about that, in that one of my friends called me and said that his neighbor was told by their service guy that they needed to drain his pool. Now, I'm in Central Texas, and if you live around Central Texas, or if you heard about what's going on, we haven't had rain in weeks and weeks and weeks. We're in a pretty bad drought, and it's pretty tough. And so his neighbor is saying, well, I have a 25 or 30,000 gallon pool, and he wants me to drain it. And I don't know about draining 25,000 gallons in a severe drought. I mean, we're not even supposed to be watering outdoors, right? That's how bad the drought is. And so what do I do, right? So, well, there's a couple things you can do, actually. If you don't want to drain the pool, you can actually go on some of the API products. And like we have always said, this is not a sales-oriented podcast or video podcast, but there are things that you can do to supplant the relation or the reliance on chlorine, or at least a ton of chlorine. And a lot of them are pictured here, especially the sponsor of our podcast today, OxySplash, is a product that can actually oxidize water without using chlorine, and the stabilizer reading does not have any effect on it. Easy Pool, if you go on the Easy Pool program, the amount of chlorine that you use goes down about 90 to 95%, depending on where you're at in the country. Or, because essentially the Easy Pool program is, if you have the right calcium, which is 300 or higher, you can literally go down to about a chlorine tablet per 10,000 gallons per week in most cases. So that amount of chlorine, because the Easy Pool is taking the brunt of all of the work to proactively keep the water stain-free, scale-free, algae-free, clear, shock, balanced, all that stuff. And so you can actually not have to worry about using dichlor or liquid chlorine or cal hypo if you have high calcium. You can literally go down to about a chlorine tablet or its equivalent once per week, which is pretty awesome.
And that way it climbs a heck of a lot faster, because like we said a couple times, it doesn't go away.
Right. So you can actually mitigate the rise of the cyanuric acid, but we also have a lot of dealers that are specifically using the Easy Pool program in places where they have high cyanuric acid or high calcium, because it works fine in those instances without having to drain water, especially if you have a vinyl pool, a fiberglass pool, a high water table, or in a drought. It's a great alternative to,
or let's be
using
real,
a ton of chlorine.
Let's be real. An angry customer that completely refuses to drain and refill their pool.
That's true.
That happens a lot.
Yep. All those things. So I mean, those are great products. And the thing is, every time that we plan these out, we're thinking, this is going to take long, 10, 15 minutes, kind of like the Seinfeld episode, 5-10 minutes. But this is actually going on 30 minutes now. And we actually, I think, have a lot of great information in there. But here is a checklist of the things that we've talked about. So you want to go over this, Brett, and then we can sign off.
Sure do. It has a ton of different names. We talked about those earlier. It's added directly as cyanuric acid, either granular or liquid, or indirectly through the use of stabilized chlorine like dichlor or trichlor. It's necessary in outdoor pools to protect sunlight, chlorine from sunlight. You don't need it in an indoor pool. Too much isn't better. There's a point of diminishing returns where it actually is detrimental to have too much cyanuric acid. Elevated, it can cause testing interference with your alkalinity. So it would actually show your alkalinity is falsely high. So there's a formula to use to counter that. So you can actually figure out what your water balance actually is by removing the cyanuric acid interference. If you're trying to conserve water, reduce the amount of cyanuric acid you're using because it only climbs, it never goes away. So like what Matt was saying on the previous slide, if you can use products that reduce the amount of chlorine that you have to add to keep your pool running, and you're adding trichlor or dichlor, it's going to help to keep the cyanuric acid level low or in the range where you actually want it. You're just taking some of the heavy lifting off of the chlorine so the chlorine can focus on what it's doing. Elevated levels, they need to be dropped. You need to bring them down. You can either do that by draining and refilling. There's certain products out there, or you can do different programs. Like Matt was saying, you can use Easy Pool as a crutch to try and get you through. Because over time, think if you've got a sand filter, just from regular backwashing and refilling, it's going to come down slowly over time because every time you backwash, you're losing a couple hundred gallons of water. So it'll, or
heaven forbid, throw a pool party.
Yeah, have some fun.
You know, have the neighborhood kids over, or your drunk friends over, or whatever, and do some cannonballs. Have a cannonball contest and all that.
Hopefully not the drunk kids though. That's bad.
No, one or the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then operating at elevated levels end up costing you more in the long run. So if you're talking to a customer that's completely resistant to draining their pool and they've got ridiculously high cyanuric acid, think like 300 parts per million, just explain it to them. It's going to hurt your wallet in the long run if you keep operating longer at higher levels than it is if you're just going to throw some water away and refill the pool. It sucks to have to put new water in, but at the same time, it's going to be cheaper in the long run. So
yeah.
Whew, I think that's it.
That's it. All right. So this is the end of this episode. It's been awesome. This is season 3, episode 4. Please like, share, subscribe if you feel like it. If you feel like it. You know, we really like doing this. And
if you don't like, keep it to yourself. Really?
No. We love the comments, but anytime that you can share it, it really helps the channel. And you know, we like to get this message out because, you know, you can tell how we feel, how we care about the different things that are going on in pools. And really with the end result for Stacy and the boys is to help the pools have a more healthy pool environment, thus being healthier for the swimmers, but also the longevity of the equipment and the earth. So whatever we can do to help, we like to do that. So if you would like, share, and subscribe, we'd think that's pretty awesome, and thank you very much. So with that being said, we will
see you later.
See you later.